Last week, I watched 7 nature films and got inspired to create my own animal hybrid and to animate it. I then gave you these 4 different options and you chose for me to animate this one, which combines the graceful movement of a ribbon eel with the flapping of the wings of a flying fish. Now let me walk you through how I brought this guy to life. By the way, and as always, if you're here within the first 48 hours of the video being live, you can grab for free all the files I used on it. If you're later in that, they'll eventually be up on my Gumroad and Patreon. Day 1 was all about understanding the movement of the ribbon eel and trying to incorporate that into my own animation. As you can see, it took me various attempts to come up with something I was happy with. This is pretty much a wave animation, the type you'd normally see with a flag flapping on the wind, but since it now happens on water, it behaved very differently and gave this mesmerizing floaty sensation. The trickiest part was definitely making it into a loop, which means the last frame of your animation should seamlessly transition into the first one. There's 2 main ways of animating. The first one is called pose to pose, in which you first draw 2 important poses of your characters or objects and then fill the gaps between them. The other one is called the straight ahead animation, which basically means you make your drawings one after the other. They each have their strengths and weaknesses, and you'll see me using a combination of both of them here. If this weren't a loop, I would have gone only straight ahead, but since I need to end in the same place I started, I had to use that pose as a reference. After close to 2 hours of studying the movement and some trial and error, I was able to come up with this little guide for the looping motion. I originally thought about making my creature start off swimming, glide for a bit, and then get back into the water, but by day 2 I had a different plan. I would be making a magical flying ribbon dragon. The first thing I needed to do was change the shape of my looping wave. I had noticed the reference resembled more the curves of a number 8, and mine was looking more like a sine wave. I started the day off by pushing the shapes a bit more while using some extra little tricks from the principles of animation, namely secondary action, which is having an extra movement in parts of an object. In my case, every hill and valley was moving backwards, but I wanted to make it so that the front and the back of them either dragged behind or accelerated at a different rate. Once I was happy with my new loop, I went on to add the thickness of the body. At first I started doing it by the way I would have done it without reference, but then I realized the ribbon eel did it differently, and it's what made it look all twisted and cool. After that I added the wings, which I had to track to create the illusion they were at a fixed distance from the head and the tail respectively, while making sure that they had the impact they deserved, plus making sure that the wings in the front didn't flap at the same time as the ones on the back did. Finally, I spent some time designing the head of my creature. As you can see, the ribbon eel has a very derpy looking face, with the tiny eyes and its mouth open and pretty much every reference I could find, so I went with a more dragon inspired look in the end. Then I tracked the head to the movement, correcting some errors and arcs along the way, and I was finally done with a very rough animation of my dragon. I wanted to avoid the next step in this animation, you'll see why on day 4, so for the 3rd day I chose to design the environment my dragon would be moving through. The more I kept working on this, the clearer was my vision of the final product, and there was one game that kept coming to my mind's eye as inspiration. The playing levels of Cuphead have a very specific structure. The boss is flying backwards at a pretty much fixed position in the screen, and the background moves around them to complete the illusion. I wanted to do basically the same, but with my dragon looking forwards. This would pose a couple of challenges. The first one being, any texture I made which occupied the whole width of the screen would have to be able to tile seamlessly horizontally. Luckily, Photoshop has a tool that helps with that, which meant I just needed to draw my mountains freely, which were the only 2 illustrations that occupy the whole width of the frame, and then I would offset the whole drawing and clean up the clear disconnect that originally appeared at the edges. During this process, one of you in the stream suggested to add a little Easter egg, so Wilson from Castaway is abandoned somewhere in the mountains. Let me know if you spot them on the final animation. One of the coolest and probably most annoying things about Cuphead is that sometimes there are environment layers that pass closer to the camera than you do, pretty much making you be playing blind for a short time. I wanted to do this in my animation, so I chose 3 different structures that would behave like this. It was very important to keep everything on a separate layer to be able to animate them independently later. I also decided in the process to make 3 different cloud designs with a very clear Japanese graphic style, but adding some shading to better integrate them with the other layers. I also made 5 different very simple treetops, which in hindsight I should have placed and designed higher on the screen to have some extra information to play with in the final composition. Once I was done with that, I moved over to After Effects for a little test. In backgrounds, there's usually 3 different groups called foreground, midground, and background, which refer to how close or far they are relative to the point of view. I mentioned them from the closest to the farthest. There are some tricks to reinforce this illusion of depth. A great summary of them is the farther away an object is, the smaller, less saturated, bluer, and less contrasty it's going to look. You can find great information about this online, but let me know if you'd like me to explain further. When we add movement to the equation, there's another rule called the parallax effect, which is super simple to use and understand. If you want to see it for yourself, try this. Place one finger facing up and pointing at something, but keep it very close to your eyes. Then do the same with a finger from your other hand, but this time keep it as far away from your head as you can. Now look at the object both your fingers are pointing at, and rotate your head from left to right. You'll notice the finger closer to you immediately loses track of the object, while the other one should be on target or at least seem less lost. We can use this in animation to reinforce depth by having objects that are closer to the screen move faster than the ones that are back. We can even have some things that don't move at all if they're far enough away, which is what I'm doing with my sky here. After this test, I added some copies of the elements and made it loop seamlessly, but I did it on my own time and didn't record it. The missing piece of the puzzle was breathing on my neck. If there's one process I hate with all my god within the animation pipeline, it's cleanup. And day 4's stream was pretty much 3 hours of me trying to concentrate to get done with that. For those of you who don't know, after you are done doing a rough animation, there's an intermediate process called tie down, in which you basically put everything in model, which is a fancy way of saying you make sure the proportions are correct and the characters or object you're animating is recognizable throughout the whole length of the animation, with all the lines and details present in its design. After that comes cleanup, which is taking the tie down and refining it even more. I've tried doing very pristine cleanups in the past, using very digital looking lines, and let me say it is a very hard process, at least for me. Any little mistake pops into the eye of most viewers, and for that reason I decided to go a different route. Instead of doing a tie down and then the cleanup, I basically combined both processes into one, which is a very misleading way of saying that I basically took my tie down as my final line. I like the roughness of lines varying this much. It reminds me a lot of 101 Dalmatians, but that look was actually a product of its time and Walt Disney hated it. I think it shows the human hand and error behind every drawing, and I really like that about it. This whole process you're seeing sped up took 3 hours of my life. I want to blame the brush a bit. It had some weird behavior I couldn't figure out how to correct. In essence, the speed of my strokes determined the width of the line instead of the amount of pressure I applied. A faster stroke would give me a very thick line, and a slower one would make it behave closer to the intended way. This is how it looked at the cleanup stage, and if we put it side to side with the rough animation, you can see it's far easier to understand what's going on. Then I moved on to color everything, using a placeholder palette that would help me fill all the little gaps that came from my sloppy cleanup. For the final product, I would then change it to colors that work better with the overall palette and intention of the final image. I'm bringing too much attention to these processes because they were the ones I enjoyed the least, so enjoy. And now all that was left to do was take all of this back into After Effects and make sure it looked pretty. This is the final result. I feel like I nailed the oriental style and feeling of it, and I'm really happy with how it turned out, especially for having done it mostly live and over the span of 4 days. If you enjoyed this, I have great news for you. I'm doing a project like this one every single week for a whole year, and this is just the first episode. The week this video is out, I'll be doing a writing practice by coming up with a worthy sequel for Megamind. You can catch me live either here on YouTube or on Twitch. The week after that, I'll be turning the characters of one of these Adam Sandler films into cartoons, and the cool part is you can choose which, either by voting here on YouTube in the poll you'll find linked in the description, or by going to my Instagram and voting there. You can also choose the theme for the following week every Wednesday exclusively on my YouTube polls. My name is Weirdy, see you on the next one.